remain standing, hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
One day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please do take your seats. I think my microphone is working now. Sorry about that as we got going. Well, in the wake of Storm Dudley and Storm Eunice, you couldn't get much more of an open goal with our gospel reading today. I wonder how often the calming of the storm has been the lectionary reading set for a day after we've had a red weather warning across the United Kingdom. And in fact, all the songs we've been singing, they take on a different complexion, don't they? Talking about God's power shown in creation in the light of what we've seen over the past few days. But it did make me wonder, as I was watching the news, how would we feel coming to church today, if we even came to church, if we'd lost things in Storm Eunice, if we'd lost our home, if we were one of those houses that had a tree fall on them or a car, or even more so if we'd lost loved ones. It would be easy to think, wouldn't it, that God was somehow asleep at the wheel of the world, just like Jesus was asleep in that boat as his disciples think they're going to drown. It's one of the commonest questions people have. If God has this much power, if the God we meet in Jesus is this same God who created the world, why wouldn't he do something to stop those people dying? And so a lot of people, I think, when we come to readings like the calming of the storm, we make it quite quickly into a metaphor. Jesus can protect us, can keep us safe in the midst of the storms of life. And it's a great comfort to think that he might be able to do that. That if you're in your little boat, you're about to go out on the open sea and experience great sort of turmoil, there is someone in Jesus Christ who can calm those waves. If you're in the midst of turmoil, that might be something that you're clinging on to. I've always wondered how, if that is a sort of, if you like, a fair move to make. Can we make this story into a metaphor? As comforting as it is it fair to the story to do that? One of the challenges is that often we think about Jesus, if you like, calming the storms of our lives in a way that therefore gives us a sort of inner peace and tranquility. That's often how I appropriate, if you like, this passage, to mean that whatever I'm going through, however steep and violent the waves are, with Jesus I can be tranquil on the inside. But did you notice the reaction of the disciples to all that's happened? Obviously they're terrified at the start when the storm's getting up. But by the end, if anything, they are more terrified. It's not as if they have inner tranquility and peace. In verse 25, Luke really labours the point more so than the other Gospels. He says, in fear and amazement, they ask one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." They end this episode more afraid of Jesus than of the storm. If Jesus has calmed the storms in their life, it hasn't left them with inner peace and tranquility so much as bigger questions. And in some way, more terror at the identity of Jesus. So how do we take this passage and, if you like, apply it to our lives today? In the wake of a storm Eunice, in the wake of our own personal storms, can we take comfort? Can we even find meaning in this episode? I think we can, But to get there, we need to understand at least two things that are going on in the story. The first thing we need to understand is the meaning of the storm. And then we need to think about the meaning of that question that Jesus asked his disciples in verse 25, where is your faith? We'll come back to that. But first of all, the meaning of the storm. In one sense, obviously, the meaning of the storm is there was a storm. It was a very violent storm. These were fishermen. They were experienced sailors on this particular lake, Lake Galilee. A normal storm wouldn't have caused them much trouble. They knew how to get through them. Clearly, this was a storm on another level. They're terrified. The boat looks like it's going to sink. The storm is a very violent storm. On one level, that's what's going on. But on a deeper level, for Jews, like these disciples, like Jesus himself was, a big body of water like Lake Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee, as it was often known, big bodies of water like that symbolized more than just a lake full of H2O. Lakes, seas, these kind of bodies of water were symbolic. They were symbolic of the chaos that is out there in the world. They were symbolic of power that was operative in the world beyond any human being's ability to control. And of course, when you see what damage Storm Eunice has done, you can see why they might have thought that. If you've ever seen, either in person or past few days on telly, the sort of power that a large body of water has, if it's just whipped up in the right way, it's terrifying. The way that waves can treat even large ocean liners as if they're child's play toys and just toss them around. And then there are the creatures that live in seas. You might well have seen the story, that tragic story of Simon Nellist, killed by a shark attack in Australia this past week. The sea is full of scary things, and it can do scary things to you. No wonder that for these people, this culture, the sea, lakes like Lake Galilee were more than just lakes. They were a sort of representation, a picture of the way that we live in a world that is breathtaking, beautiful, strikes awe and wonder into us, but in one sense it's scary. It's a world that we're not in full control of ourselves, a world that we can't tie down, a world that we can't master. That is quite a hard thing for people like us today, some 2,000 years later. That's quite a hard thing for us to grasp. Because so much of the story of the past, 100, 200, 300 years, you pick exactly how long it's been going on, the story of our modern world in the West is that really there is nothing beyond us that is out of our control. As human beings, the story that we have told ourselves as a Western culture that's been sort of drilled into us, that we've almost learnt by rote without sometimes even knowing it and realizing it's been happening, is that we are the captains of our fate. We are the masters of our destiny. Some of us as individuals experience that in a particular strong way, but even just as a human race, we have told ourselves over the centuries in the West that there's nothing that we can't defeat if we just turn our minds to it. Now, we might be restricted in all kinds of ways right now. There might be ways in which we are sort of bound, shackled, in chains. But all we need to do is get rid of those chains, throw off those shackles, and our potential is limitless. There is nothing beyond you, this the story goes, that needs to have a sort of control, that needs to constrain your life. And so I suppose one thing that we might need to hear from Luke chapter 8 is that story we've been telling ourselves, that we hear, that we repeat even at the back of our minds, is simply not the way the world is. At one level, what Jesus is saying to us, to them, is there are things that are beyond your control. Terry Eagleton, the literary critic, put it like this: the vital enlightenment project, that story I've said has been going around our minds for the past several hundred years, the vital enlightenment project of controlling nature, which frees us from being the crushed and afflicted victims of our environment, has resulted in the wholesale pollution of the planet. It's a dense sentence in one sense, but all he's really saying is that if we believe that you can control things that are beyond you, nature itself even, which is part of the story that we've been telling ourselves in the West for the past several hundred years at least, it's going to make you into a tyrant. It's going to cause you to do great damage to nature, as, lo and behold, it has done. If we think that there's nothing beyond us that needs to have any constraint on us, then is it any surprise we've gone out into the world seeking just to take advantage of all the resources that are there without thought for, if you like, the bigger reality that nature might represent. And so, we're on the edge of climate disaster. Thinking you can control nature backfires in a terrible way, and here we are, experiencing that backfiring, playing out in our lifetimes, within 1 or 2 generations. If we deny, in other words, that there is power, there are things beyond us that are out of our control, we will do terrible damage to ourselves and to others. And this isn't the only thing that's been going on with COVID over the past 2 years. But I wonder if you have begun to see and hear, on the one hand, a level of fear, which, you remember right at the start of the pandemic, of course it was understandable. We saw those scenes of hospitals being overrun in wealthy Western nations like Italy, and it struck terror into all of us. But also alongside that fear, somewhere inside, we desperately want to control the virus. In fact, that was one of our government slogans at some point during the pandemic, that we can master this. Has that been a healthy attitude to have in the face of COVID-19? Because in the end, does COVID not represent something, again, that we can't control? It's too small. We don't even yet know fully how it spreads. Of course, there are things we have done, and must keep on doing to mitigate, to protect those who are the most vulnerable as best we can. But at least part of the story in the West as we've dealt with COVID, maybe a sort of undercurrent, is a belief that we could control this. And when it turns out we can't, what are we left with but fear? Fear for our lives, for our loved ones, but fear that has in one sense no escape. Jesus is saying in Luke chapter 8, there really are things that are beyond your control. That's hard for us to accept. That's hard for us to believe in the West. But it is not cowardice to say that that is so. It is not cowardice to say that you and I, humanity, is finite, is constrained. We don't have it in our power to fix everything. We will keep on coming up against things individually, as a community like this, as a human race, that is simply beyond our ability to deal with. We have incredible capacity to do good. Again, hasn't the COVID-19 crisis shown that? The ability of science, the ability of intelligent people in government to work out the sort of things we might need to do to keep each other safe. But if you like, we overdo that belief in our ability to do good, to bring change and so on, we will find ourselves, like the disciples, in the boat filling with water that we can do nothing about. And it will be all the more terrifying for us. And I just wonder if part of the reason why Jesus takes his disciples out onto the lake like he does and then falls asleep, it's really striking that Luke really emphasizes that. It's Jesus' idea to go out onto the lake, and straight away he falls asleep. Could it be that he did that so that, if you like, they would be confronted with the reality of their situation? They would have known. They lived in a society that, like I said, it was common to associate these bodies of water with chaos, with things beyond their control. At one level, they'd have known it. That they were small, and that there were things that had power over them that they couldn't control. But they really knew it when they were in the middle of that storm. Could it be that Jesus went to sleep that day so that they would see what the world is really like and be convinced about it, more than just in their head? And could it be that that is at least part of what's going on in our lives when we have those moments of coming up against things that we don't have control over? Part of my role here at St. Bartholomew's is to learn how to be a priest, a vicar. And so the past few weeks, is particularly just the way that my sort of training has worked out, I've been taking a number of funerals. And we know, don't we, when we come to a funeral, that we are in the presence of powers beyond our control. Death itself, that we cannot defeat, we cannot outrun. And as much as it is so painful, as funerals approach, as we go through that process of saying goodbye to our loved ones, as painful as that process is, well, if it wakes us up to this bigger truth that there is a world beyond our control outside of us, that there are powers that we don't have mastery over, well, even though it might seem sometimes like Jesus is sleeping in the midst of the storms we face, if it wakes us up to what's really going on in our world, that we are guests of a bigger reality, we aren't the makers of our reality, we're guests of God's reality, well, maybe, just maybe, that will do us some deep, deep good. Not an easy lesson, not a comfortable lesson to learn, but to understand the way the world really is. Maybe that's Jesus' intention in the midst of those storms that we face. That's the meaning of the storm. Secondly, the meaning of Jesus' question. Where is your faith? He asked them. As he turns to his disciples, as he rouses from his sleep and sees them in terror, panicking, it's a curious question he asks. As he calms that storm before them, you think he might say, there you are, guys, all done. Back to sleep for me. Or let's get on. But he doesn't. He turns to them and says, where is your faith? It's almost as if he sees their faith as like something that they've misplaced, something they have that is theirs, but they've put it down somewhere and forgotten to pick it up again. One of my Christmas presents from Jenny this year was, you might have seen these things, little buttons you attach to your keys. So if you ever lose your keys, you open your phone, press a little button on your phone, and your keys start making a noise at you so you can go and find them. Jenny bought me one for my keys and for my wallet. As long as you have one of those three things, your keys, wallet or phone, you can always find the other two. I have not yet lost all three, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time. But, when you misplace things, your tile helps you go and find them and pick them up again. It's almost like Jesus sees their faith as a bit like that. Something that's theirs, but they haven't got it out. They've left it somewhere. They've misplaced it. Where is it, he says to them. And I think what's going on here for these disciples, their faith is all kind of connected with who they are learning that Jesus is. See, by this point in the gospel, The disciples have encountered Jesus and have started to follow him, and they've learned quite a lot about him. They've seen him perform amazing miracles. They know, in one sense, he has power over nature. Chapter 5, which we looked at a few weeks ago, Jesus brings a miraculous catch of fish, which again strikes terror into them because it's so overwhelming. In one sense, Jesus has already shown his mastery over this lake. He can control it and bring forth a huge catch of fish from it, a terrifying catch of fish, but he's in control of it. So they already know that they can trust him. Chapter 7, Jesus has already shown he has power over that greatest enemy of all, death. A widow's son who has tragically died and left his mother all alone, and Jesus comes, reaches out and touches his coffin, basically, and brings him back to life again. If there's anyone who has control over the things that are uncontrollable in these disciples' world, it's Jesus Christ. They're learning. They know at one level. He is the one who has control over the uncontrollable in their lives. And yet in this moment, they misplace that. They lose hold of that wonderful, comforting truth. In the midst of the storm, they forget. They misplace their faith, if you like. And isn't that true in our lives as well? Time and again, when those storms rear their head, those things, when I'm confronted with things that I can't control, things that throw me, that catch me off guard, and just sort of like a piercing light coming through. I'm not in control of my life. There's things that are beyond me that I can't master. How easy it is to, like me with my keys, just let them slip away and I forget where I've put them. I lose sight of what I know about Jesus Christ, what I've come to learn about him, along with these disciples. That he is Lord of the darkest, most red alert storms, whatever they are. But so often I either take on the storm myself head on, think I've got this, it's terrifying, but I'll stand up tall and just walk straight into it and deal with it, or I run in despair. It's like Jesus says to these disciples, and he says to us in those moments, find me. That's what Jesus says, find me. Come to me. Because I'm the one who can calm this storm, can comfort you in the midst of it, can keep you safe. And in one sense, Jesus says, whatever storm you're going through, when you come to me, you'll find there is something bigger going on. You know, that's why the disciples come to the end of the story and they're even more afraid of Jesus. Because Jesus, if you like, introduces us to a God who is, in one sense, scarier, even less safe than Storm Eunice and this storm on the lake. A God who is Lord of the storm. Well, he is to be feared more than the storm. That's why the story ends like it does, I think. The disciples realize this Jesus, he has power. Like this storm is you can just tell it to be calm straight away. So what sort of power does he have? If you come to Jesus in the middle of the storm, you find, in one sense, reality is more terrifying than I thought at the start. The God of whom I am a guest in this world, well, he isn't a safe God. And yet, right at the same time, in Jesus Christ, of course, we meet a God who reaches out and touches the widow's son's coffin. A God of that depth of compassion, that he would step into the world in the person of Jesus Christ. And a God who loves you so deeply, so personally, that in his Son Jesus Christ, he would lay down his life for you and experience the deepest, darkest, most terrifying storm of all, as a human being cut off from God himself. He would do all of that so that whatever storms you go through now or tomorrow or the day after, you can be sure that God will never, ever, ever desert you and will bring you through. There's a story I heard recently of a shepherd boy in Wales, and two missionaries were passing through the area up in the sort of Welsh hills, and they shared with this little shepherd boy something of that love of Jesus Christ. And the shepherd boy became a Christian there and then. And so these two missionaries taught him part of Psalm 23 using their hands. They taught him with each one of his fingers, "The Lord is my shepherd." And they said to him, you know about shepherding. Whenever you feel afraid, whenever there are things that you can't handle, just, if you like, take your hand and go through, "The Lord is my shepherd," with each of your fingers. A few years later, the story goes, one of the missionaries was passing through this area again, spoke to some of the villagers and said, "What happened to that little shepherd boy?" And the person said, "I'm really sorry, he died. There was a storm, a big snowstorm. He was caught in a snowdrift. And it was so tragic. We couldn't get to him. Eventually we found him in the middle of the snowdrift. And he said, there was something we couldn't understand. He was holding on to his fourth finger. You see, right at that moment, that little boy found his faith. In the midst of that storm, he remembered, the Lord is my shepherd. As we come to communion today, if you like, God invites us to find that for ourselves. If you belong to Jesus Christ, the Lord is my shepherd. He has been through the very darkest storm for you. And as you receive again his body and his blood by faith, he invites you to take that in and keep it close to you. So whatever storms you go through today or tomorrow or the week after or the year after, whatever's coming up, like that little boy, you will grab hold of your fourth finger, and be sure that Jesus will protect you, will take you even through death itself, will be your God because he loves you that much. Let's be quiet for a few moments, and then Nick will lead us on in the rest of our service.